Microsoft to see.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right.
I will go.
Technology is so interesting.
Yep. The biggest improvement in technology for me so far has been the Zoom meetings.
Oh, really?
It's so much more effective, and I can get to so many more meetings than I could have if I had to drive everywhere to get to them. So I can have a meeting at Little Axe in the morning and Cave Springs at noon, and if without Zoom, I would have been just one of those meetings could have happened in the whole day, and the other one couldn't have happened. So it's helped now how to get people engaged in those Zoom meetings. When you're talking about small groups are easy, right? It's like me, you, and one other person. We can have a Zoom meeting. We can be real effective. But if it's like 10 people, the effectiveness breaks down really quickly because people are on their phone or they're doing other stuff. So that's always a challenge.
Gotcha. Wasn't it conference calls before the Zoom meetings?
We didn't use them.
Really?
Yeah, we rarely use conference calls, and I don't know why we didn't. But there's something about actually seeing the person, and I think that helps improve engagement. So I don't know. And what's funny is the technology for a Zoom call has been there for years.
Yeah, Skype's been the thing forever.
Yeah, we just didn't use it. Then we were forced to use it, and I think that's part of it. Is like when you were forced to use it through COVID, then everybody got comfortable with it, and now it's like, oh yeah, let's just Zoom this meeting instead of, just different.
Awesome, man. No, I guess that's really interesting. I didn't think about that. I never thought about that.
It's yeah, and I've got a different perspective than you because I'm older,
Yeah.
and I look at technology in a very different. I
everyone for being here. We are going to wait a couple more minutes for a few more to join, and then we will get started. So before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that as you come in, if you could please introduce yourself in the chat by providing your name, district, and role, that would be fabulous, just so we know who's here, who's attending. We like to get a feel for that. So today we have Dr. Gary Duhan presenting.
MTSS, hold on.
So Gary, you are free to get started.
All right, thank you, Madison. Good morning, everybody. I hope everything's going well, and hope you had a good break and you're ready to get back at it. For some of you guys, this might be the first day with students, so good luck with that. It's always entertaining coming back after the break. My name is Gary Duhan. I'm a faculty member at Oklahoma State University, and I'm a school psychologist. And I'm going to talk today about intensifying interventions. And I'm hoping everybody can see my presentation as we go through it. I want to do a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. The goal is to review methods of intensifying existing interventions to increase effectiveness. You can, as part of the intervention process, add intervention components or change interventions as a method of increasing effectiveness. We're not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about methods to increase the effectiveness of an existing intervention. And we'll talk a little bit about why you would do that. The agenda for today is we're going to identify the what, the why, and the when of intervention intensification, what it is, why you do it, and when do you do it. And we're going to review a structure for determining intensification strategies, and we're going to review options for engaging in these intensification practices once you've reviewed your case. And then we'll go over a couple of cases or potential examples. So first, we're going to talk about intervention intensification. The question of what is intervention intensification? It's the practice of altering the time, effort, and resources incorporated into an intervention. That's sort of the book definition or the practical definition of it. And the why behind intensification of an intervention is to increase the effectiveness of that intervention. And you want to increase the effectiveness for a couple of reasons. One, you might want to increase the rate of change, or you want them to grow faster, or how fast they learn. You might want to increase maintenance or retention of learning over time. Sometimes students learn stuff, but over breaks or weekends, they lose it. We want to increase that retention. Or sometimes we want to enhance the generalization of effect or the reach of that intervention. Does it work beyond my setting or beyond my instructional practices? And so those are the reasons why we intensify interventions. But there's a problem with those two definitions, the what and the why, because there's a little bit of a disconnect I want you guys to make note of. The purpose of intensification is to increase effect, but the practice of intensification is typically defined by a change in practice. So when someone attempts to intensify an intervention, you change something you do. But that doesn't necessarily mean it will have the effect you want it to have. You may be changing the intervention approach, you may be changing the resources you use, but that doesn't mean it works. So intensification efforts that don't increase the effects were not effective intensification efforts in the first place. And so it's kind of like the tree falling in the woods question. Well, if you intensified an intervention and it didn't increase the effect, did you really intensify it after all? And the answer is not really. So the attempt does not always produce the outcome you want. And that's something I want you to keep your eyes on as we think about this practice. Next question is, when do we intensify? Well, we intensify when there's a lack of sufficient response. And those three terms, rate, retention, and reach, we talked about a minute ago, is what you need to be looking at. When you need to increase the rate of growth or the retention of learned material or the reach or impact of these material, the learning, intensification is a good first step. Now, something I also want to make note of is that when you attempt to intensify an intervention, you've always got to be sure that the intervention is being implemented as designed before you make any changes. In other words, if you're not 100% sure that the existing intervention is being implemented correctly and as frequently as it's designed to be implemented, you're not ready to implement any intensification efforts. And hopefully that makes pretty clear sense. If they're not doing the intervention as often as it's supposed to be done, why would we expect the effect we're trying to get? If we've got an intervention that's supposed to be implemented 5 days a week and it's only been run 2 days a week, it's probably not going to produce the outcomes. And before we change the intervention, we want to implement it all 5 days a week. Or if we've got several components and only some of them are being implemented consistently, we want to make sure it's being implemented consistently at full capacity before we start making changes. Otherwise, we won't know if the changes are effective because of the new components or because of changes of implementation, or if any failure might be due to still poor implementation. So that being said, intensification is not simply adding intervention time or making smaller groups. It's a very common practice I see in the field is, hey, we need to intensify this intervention. Let's add more time, or let's change the grouping and the student-teacher ratio. When you do add more time, what do you do with that time? That's the real question. Additional time doesn't mean anything if you're not changing something about the intervention. Is the additional time producing more practice on the same intervention? That's an intensification. Is it producing more intervention targeting the same skill, maybe adding another component to the intervention? Or is the intervention targeting a similar skill? So when you're thinking about more time, what is being done with that time? If the exact same activities are being done with just more time given, it's probably not much of an intensification. And the same goes for a smaller student-teacher ratio. When we change the groups and we maybe change the student-teacher ratio, does that produce more individualized instruction, more corrective feedback, or more opportunities for or individual responding? Those are types of intensifications. But if that's not happening as a result of the group size, if we're changing the group size and we're doing the exact same thing we were doing before the intensification, it's really not an intensification. Now, there's a lot of other methods of intensification out there, and you see these all the time in the literature and just people talk about them. More teacher-centered systematic instruction, more explicit instruction, more frequent intervention sessions, longer intervention sessions, interventionists with greater expertise or specialization, more opportunities to respond, more time on difficult activities, added point system for motivation. Lots of things are thrown out there. And these things can all be added to intervention, but it feels very haphazard and unsystematic. And just throwing ideas out there is not the way you want to do this. You really want to have a systematic process and to be thinking through a couple of questions as you're making those decisions to
You don't need
intensify
me, do you?
an intervention.
Okay, okay. I'll be in the library in case you do.
So let's get more systematic. When selecting methods of intensification, two things should be considered. First, the problem being targeted. Intensification efforts need to match the problem. So based upon what you're trying to accomplish, what change you're trying to make for that child, what skill you're trying to develop, that will determine the types of intensifications that are best suited for that intervention. And then also the components in the intervention need to be reviewed. The components that you're utilizing and the components that you're not utilizing. And we'll talk about those as we go through this practice. So those two considerations again, intervention components and problem type. We're going to talk about intervention components first. Every intervention has these three components in it, whether they're well-defined or not, they all exist in intervention, in any intervention. There's an antecedent, there's a response, and there's a consequence. And we refer to this as the arc. Intervention components can, and these are the intervention components that can be altered. Antecedent is what happens immediately before the student is supposed to respond. It's the instruction that's given, presenting of a flashcard, giving the student a math worksheet, asking a question, gesturing to an instructional aid like a number line or something like that, or modeling a specific skill or task. These are the antecedents. They come before the student response, and they're designed to promote correct responding. Now, what can we modify about these things? What kind of antecedent modifications can we utilize? Well, we can intensify antecedent modifications. We can intensify antecedents by increasing the frequency of these cues. We can do it more often. We can make the cues more salient. We can highlight them, make them easier to see, easier to notice, and draw their attention to them. Or we can provide more detailed instruction, more, not just more frequent, but more detail on the cues or the antecedents we provide. And I'll show you some examples in a little bit of how that looks. The response, the second part of the arc, is the measurable and observable active response from the student. It's what we want the student to do, the correct response in most cases we want to see from the student. Saying the sight word when being presented with a flashcard, reading a passage when being prompted, answering questions about a passage, writing an answer to a math problem after being presented with a math sheet. These are the responses we want to see. And we can modify these responses in a way to produce better interventions by doing things like changing the modality of the response. Sometimes by changing the modality, we can increase the learning rate by increasing opportunities to respond. We can also reduce the set size. Oftentimes we provide students with large sets of items to learn, and that can really slow learning. So set size becomes a very important component in this. And then finally, we can add additional response modalities to promote generalization. We can have them write it sometimes, say it other times, and this can promote generalization across tasks. And then the final component of the arc is the consequence. And this is what happens immediately following a student's response. Whether that response be an accurate response or an inaccurate response, our consequence, our follow-up to that response is very important. For example, saying things like, yes, that's correct, or praising hard work, you did a really good job, or providing corrective feedback, no, the answer is 7, or providing feedback about beating a goal or rewarding for beating a goal. So all of these things are consequences that happen after the response or after a series of responses that can promote learning. Now, when we try to modify these consequences, we can modify them in a few different ways. We can increase the frequency, provide more feedback for each response or for every other response or for groups of responses. We can provide the salience, more salient feedback instead of just good job, being very specific about our consequences or our for each response. And we can provide more detailed feedback, giving more feedback about what they're doing correctly or incorrectly. These are ways in which we can modify. Now, beyond the components of the intervention, we can also talk about the problem types, because not every problem type can be modified or intensified the same way. The three most problem types you're going to deal with as teachers and in the field are skill acquisition, skill fluency, and performance deficits. There are other problems that exist, but for the most part, these are the ones we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Skill acquisition problems. This is when a student's performance is simply inaccurate. It may not be 100% inaccurate, but there's not sufficient accuracy that they can engage in the skill independently without high level of precision. So they don't know how to perform the skill required, at least not at the level that we need them to be. For example, a student may be reading 40 words correct per minute with 60% accuracy, which means they're 40% inaccurate. And we all know that if a student is inaccurate in that many words while reading, they're never going to be able to comprehend. They're never going to be able to get through passages effectively. So this is clearly an acquisition problem. They need to learn to read more accurately. Or a student who has 10 digits correct per minute with 40% accuracy, it means they're 60% inaccurate. This student is not independent when it comes to solving math problems and needs more practice to become accurate before they can move on to the next level of performance, which is fluency, skill fluency. And oftentimes we have kids who are accurate, but they're so slow and laborious that it interferes with performance. So in other words, fluency problems, performance is accurate but slow. And this is a problem because it often requires too much cognitive energy, and the students cannot use the skill for more advanced applications. Just think about any 4th or 5th grade teacher could tell you if the students are counting on their fingers and toes to solve simple addition problems, they're not going to get through basic algebra. So getting them not only accurate, but fluent to where these tasks don't require a lot of cognitive energy or brain power so that they can focus on the more advanced skills is really critical moving forward. So examples of skill fluency problems would be the student is 40 digits correct per minute, 40 words correct per minute in reading with 90% accuracy. Anything less than 90% we're really concerned about. We really want to see kids at 95 and above in terms of their accuracy. But the goal for this student on 2nd grade might be around 70 words correct per minute. They're reading almost half of the speed they're supposed to be reading to be effective. And so we want to build their fluency with this reading skill. Or if a student is 10 digits correct per minute in simple addition, sums to 9 with 95% accuracy, that's accuracy is pretty good. We like them at 100%, but because they're only 10 digits correct per minute, it literally takes them 6 seconds to solve a single addition problem. 2 plus 3, it takes them 6 seconds to solve that problem. That's too long. They're never going to be able to move beyond basic addition without those more advanced skills. So we want to look at fluency-based interventions and modifications. And then the third type of problem is a performance deficit problem. And this is when the skill is present, the student knows how to perform the skill, but doesn't perform it when required. And there are really 2 reasons why this happens. One is because they don't want to. There's not enough motivation for them to engage in the problem, in the target behavior. And 2, sometimes they don't know they're supposed to do it. They don't know when they're supposed to do it. So both of those reasons can help us help us understand what's going on with the student. The performance is necessary to evaluate learning outcomes, and they're just not doing it. So we don't know what they can and can't do. This is a performance deficit. And the example below is from let's say a reading passage. The student reads a passage in the 40 words correct per minute with 70% accuracy, which is both too slow and insufficiently accurate. And when we give them a second passage and we offer them a reward or a prize for doing better, they increase to 65 words correct per minute with 85% accuracy. That tells me there's some motivational issues there we need to address when moving forward. So putting this together, if you take the arc, the antecedent, the response, and the consequence, and we look at the problem behaviors, we can see what we need to be adjusting when interventions aren't working as well as we want them to work. So to intensify interventions, you can change one, two, or all three of these components. You can change the antecedent, you can change the response, you can change the consequence, or you can do all three of them based upon your resources and your opportunities to engage in changes in those interventions. Each problem type has a specific set of options for each component. I'm going to show you these, and we'll talk through a few of them. So for acquisition interventions, this is where a student is inaccurate and needs to become accurate. We can intensify antecedents, the A in the arc, by providing modeling for correct responding, for cueing appropriate processes, for cueing the appropriate process. Modeling would be something like, if you've ever heard a listening passage preview, if you've got a student who's reading and they're inaccurate, modeling passage reading beforehand, before they read, is a good intensification. It's a good manipulation of the intervention to increase their accuracy. You're modeling not only the word reading, but you're also modeling prosody and pauses and things like that. So it really will promote a more smooth, natural reading. Cover copy compares an intervention we use for math quite often, which shows an actual model of a solved problem. You cover up that model and the student repeats what they saw, and it helps them memorize the accurate facts. You can also cue appropriate process by pointing to the number line and showing them how to engage in the process you want them to engage in to solve the problem. If you're talking about teaching a young child how to use a number line to count up or to look at greater than or less than, you can actually model that actual behavior you want them to see them engage in so that they're more accurate. You can highlight comprehension question strategies, highlighting the actual questions or vocabulary within the questions that initiate types of practices or processes. If you're thinking about a word problem in math, words like more than or less than might signal using an addition or subtraction algorithm, and this would assist the student in determining what practices to use. And you can also verbally remind them to use a specific strategy. Hey, you see this number is greater than this, so you need to borrow. Things like that are nice intensification strategies. When it comes to the response for acquisition interventions, you can intensify them by providing more opportunities to respond. That is simply more practice. And remember earlier we talked about adding time. If adding time doesn't increase opportunities to respond, what are you doing it for? Adding time should increase opportunities to respond. If I had a 10-minute intervention and I practiced 20 problems during that 10 minutes, if I'm going to double that to 20 minutes, I should increase the number of problems I practice. That's more opportunities to respond, more practice. Break tasks down into smaller sets and teach them separately. Again, like I talked about earlier, set size is a big deal with some kids, especially kids who are academically behind. If I give you all the multiplication facts to learn, to memorize, that's hard. But if I give you smaller chunks, that's a little bit easier. So if they're struggling with acquiring those basic facts, smaller chunks of the facts, making sure that they become very accurate, and then moving on to the next set of facts can be a way of changing the response to intensify. Different response modalities. Sometimes kids do better when we change the modality, especially with young kids who have poor coordination. Having them write the task, having them write the response can sometimes slow them down. Now, I'm not discouraging improving kids' fine motor coordination and writing. I think it's something we need to do more and more these days. We're doing it less and less because kids have so much access to electronics, they're writing less and less. But if you've got a kid who's struggling and their ability to write is interfering with their opportunities to respond, you can alter those responses to where some of them are oral responses, that way you're increasing the frequency of their opportunities to respond or access to more problems, and that's going to produce an intensification. In terms of consequence intensifications for acquisition interventions, feedback on every response might be a way of intensifying. If maybe we were only giving them feedback at the end of the session, we're going to give them feedback on every response they make so that they know they're right, or when they're wrong, they don't practice incorrect responses multiple times. We'll provide immediate corrective feedback. When they get it wrong, we tell them it's wrong and we make them repeat the problem in the correct way. This is, again, another way of providing corrective feedback in the immediate sense to intensify an intervention. Now, what's this look like? I threw out a bunch of stuff, but this little graphic here kind of lays it out for you. If you've got an acquisition deficit, the antecedents, what can you do? You can model a correct response, or you can make this cues more salient. For the response, you can provide more OTRs, opportunities to respond, different types of responses, or smaller set sizes. And the consequence, we lay those out too. So again, you can take this graphic and you can use this when you're struggling with an intervention or struggling with how to intensify. You can decide which component we want to address, or or if you want to address multiple components, you can look at these and decide how you're going to incorporate that into your intervention. And don't worry, at the end of this presentation, I'll give some concrete examples so you can kind of see how this looks. Fluency intervention intensifications, again, for antecedents, goal setting prior to asking them to respond, or timing them. Both goal setting and timing are nice antecedent manipulations you do before they start to get them focused and get them practicing, because with fluency interventions, they're accurate. They just need to do it more to get more automatic with it. So just getting them to do it more is really the task. And so for the antecedents, timing and goal setting really work well to intensify. Response intensifications, well, we might obviously increase opportunities to respond. We can add additional reading passages or increase writing time. It's just adding more practice to this. And if you think about it from any perspective, if you want to get good at something, you need to do it a lot. So the more we can squeeze those in there, the better they're going to be. Increased trial repetitions. This is a little bit different than opportunities to respond. When we talk about opportunity to respond, we're talking about doing the activity more frequently. But increased trial repetitions are really doing the same thing over and over again. There's certain reasons why you would want to do it this way as opposed to different problems. And so, for instance, increasing opportunities to respond for a reading passage might be giving another different reading passage. But increased trial repetition would be giving them the same reading passage and having them repeat it over and over again. You might want to do the same reading passage because you want to improve not only their fluency, but their prosody, helping them read pauses, commas, and things like that. It's going to expose them to fewer novel words, but it's going to get them more familiar about reading with inflection and meaning and things like that. And in terms of consequence for fluency building, intensification, adding immediate performance feedback, positive and corrective. Good job, you're doing great. No, 2 times 8 is 16, try again. Not allowing them to practice incorrect responses. Also self-graphing, it's a really cool technique that we use all the time. It's shockingly how much kids love to graph their own performance and look at the graph grow over time. And then tangible rewards. I love tangible rewards. Kids are doing extra work. We want to reward them. And so these are all ways of providing consequences that improve effectiveness of interventions. And here's the table that goes with this one, or is the graphic that goes with this one. Fluency deficit, antecedent response, and consequence manipulations that you can utilize to intensify an intervention. Now, the last one is the performance deficit. And again, remember, this is when a student knows how to perform the task, but isn't. And I said there were 2 reasons. 1, they don't want to because there's insufficient motivation, or 2, they don't know when to do it. So if we think about the antecedent intensifications, sometimes providing them a choice of instructional procedure is a good idea. where they have, you can do this this intervention, or you can do this intervention. It's targeting the same skill, but it gives them a choice, so they feel like they have some onus in the process, and they don't feel like it's being pushed upon them. Kids really like choice sometimes. They're not choosing whether to do it or not, they're choosing which one to do. Goal setting is another thing. It motivates them to engage, and it increases the reward associated with engaging in the response. And then the last thing is clear instructions for when to perform. This is when a student knows how to do it, but isn't quite sure when to do it. We need to provide them clear instructions on when to perform this. And the best example I can give you for this one would be a social setting where a student, maybe needs to ask to participate in an activity with peers. When is it appropriate to ask? How is it appropriate to ask? I know how to ask, but I don't know when to do it. I don't know how to interject myself. So you might want, provide them more clear instructions on when to do this. It can also be applied to academics, though, is when to borrow in a multi-digit addition or subtraction problem, or when to carry and things like that. So they know how to do it. They're just not sure when to do it. Clearer instructions, more guided instructions is a nice way of providing an antecedent that will help produce a response you're looking for. In terms of the response intensifications, all responses in various formats. If the student prefers oral responses to written, allow them to respond orally. So in other words, allow them to engage in the response that they prefer. This is going to produce better responding in a lot of cases. And then the consequences, intensification, performance feedback, corrective and positive, self-graphing, and rewards. Again, motivation is the key here, and getting them on target there. And here again are your opportunities for intensification with our graphic, antecedent, response, consequence, and the different methods you can choose. Now, this is the big picture. This is everything put together. And ideally, you would have sitting down with your team, or sitting down as an interventionist and thinking, okay, I need to intensify this intervention. What is the target? Am I trying to build skill? Am I trying to build fluency? Or is this really a performance issue? And then deciding what antecedent, response, or consequence manipulations that are available to you, and which ones you can apply in that setting. So let's do some examples real quick. I'll give you some real life examples. We dealt with Brandon and phonemic segmentation fluency. That's what PSF stands for, phonemic segmentation fluency. A kindergarten student, he needs to score 35 to 45 on DIBELS, phonemic segmentation fluency, by the end of kindergarten to reach his benchmark level. That's obviously our goal for the year. We've identified him as someone who needs additional support based upon the screening assessment. He needs to make progress along an aim line that we're going to show you in just a moment to be on target for reaching that goal. Brendan's intervention, we place him on a tier 2 intervention. He receives small group instruction on phonemic segmentation from his teacher 3 days a week. So that's the core of his intervention. I'm gonna get into the details of it as an intervention in a moment, but this is our goal here. We've got, if you look at this graph, this is an old style DIBELS graph. This is phonemic segmentation, his baseline, and this is his progress, those last 3 data points on the intervention. And although looks like there might be some growth, he's not staying on the line. He's not going to reach the goal by the end of the year if we continue this. And so we need to intensify this intervention. And so another case we've got, we're going to cover both of these, this is a math case, and this is Sally. Sally has the goal of 20 digits correct per minute. In addition, sums to 18 by the end of the 2nd grade. On the screening, she scored 5 digits correct per minute, so she's well behind, and we placed her on a tier 2 intervention. And this is Sally's graph. The diamonds are her digits correct per minute, and the squares are errors. And we can see that her errors are high, and her progress, her trend line, is below where she needs to be. So this is another indication that Sally's intervention as currently implemented is not producing the effects we want, and so therefore we need to intensify. Now, in both cases, we see some change, some growth, but it's not enough. And that's a good sign that intensification should be your first option. You're seeing some effect, but not enough. If we saw no effect whatsoever, we might think that we don't have the right intervention in place. But because we see some effect, let's think about intensification. So for both Sally and Brandon, a more intensive intervention is needed if they're going to meet their goal by the end of the year. The next step is to determine how. And for each case, we're going to use some simple questions to guide this. To know what to do for intensification, we need to answer a couple of questions. What type of problem does Brandon have? And what specific intervention components intervention was completed, so we know what the existing arc is, so we can know what we can add. So with Brandon, what type of problem does he have? Brandon's assessment at the beginning of the year was 3, 5, and 2 with 100% accuracy. Now, we offer a reward to see if it was a performance issue, a motivation issue, and he didn't score any better. He scored 4. So we decided that Brandon had a fluency deficit. He knows how to engage in the behavior, but he's just really, really slow. He's accurate, but really, really slow. So this is a fluency issue. What specific intervention was completed? Well, we used a picture sliding intervention. This was for, if you're familiar with Florida Center for Reading Research, got a lot of nice interventions already packaged and ready to go for people. If you look those up, you can download those interventions if you've never heard of them. So with a group of 5 students and the teacher 3 days a week for 10 minutes. So about 30 minutes of intervention with 5 students. They placed a picture card in individual stacks on a flat surface. The student chooses a stack of picture cards and puts them in order and leaving space between the parts. The student takes turns with each picture, names the picture and the segments of the words into the phonemes while slowly sliding parts together. So, for example, the word is frog. They have F-R-O-G. They say each sound separately and then they combine them together. It's just a really simple technique for teaching them to break those sounds apart. The teacher gives corrective feedback for each picture assembled. That's the existing intervention. And you can see the antecedents and the consequences associated with it. So when it comes to fluency deficits, we can add some things, change some things. So for intensification, we can add a goal for the number, for a number during the time. We can add explicit timing. These are things we can do for antecedents. For responses, we can increase opportunities to respond. And for consequences, we can provide performance feedback and self-graphing. So what did we actually do? For our intervention intensification, the team decided to add explicit timing. We wanted him to practice with a timer. So Brandon had to blend the sounds within 5 seconds. He had to say the sounds and then blend them into the word. He had 5 seconds to try to beat the clock. It became kind of a game. And we increased opportunities to respond. He had a certain set opportunities to respond with his group, with the teacher, but we added an extra time after the other students were packing up and leaving, where he would practice a few more words with the teacher. So we used the timer, which was an antecedent manipulation, and we increased opportunities to respond. So those were our techniques that we implemented to intensify. And if you look at the results, we really got good results from it. He, his graph started shooting up pretty steep, and he met his goal ahead of time, a few weeks ahead of time, but it took a while. This is a year graph, but it took a while, but he did reach his goal, and he met a benchmark by the end of the year. Now, we'll think back on Sally. Sally, if you look at her graph, you can learn a lot about her performance from her graph. Her digits correct per minute were 6, 7, 8, but her errors were 4 and 5. So her accuracy is pretty low, and I bet you can guess that this is not a fluency issue initially. This is an accuracy issue. So what type of problem does Sally have and what specific intervention was completed? Well, the first part is what type of problem does Sally have? 4, 5, and 6 with about 60% accuracy. We offered a reward for her to see if that would change things. It didn't. She was still 50% accurate. So we identified this as a skill deficit. She needed to build accuracy first and foremost before we could do anything. So our intervention components needed to focus on accuracy. So what interventions did we have? Well, we did something called interspersal. It's an intervention you can find on interventioncentral.org or several other journal articles where we intersperse easy and hard problems, problems that are easy for her and problems that are a little bit harder for her, all within her skill set, but we want to get her to doing more problems. So she worked independently for 10 minutes a day. Sally's teacher identified challenging addition problems, ones she got wrong, and easy problems. The daily math worksheet of challenging and easy problems were created with a 1-to-1 ratio, 1 easy to 1 difficult. And Sally was given the worksheet and told she needed to complete all problems. Sally completed the worksheet, and Sally's teacher grades the worksheet and gives Sally feedback and an opportunity to redo the problem she missed. So that's the existing intervention. But we made some changes based upon the acquisition components of intensification. Thinking about if she wasn't 100% accurate, we probably need to think about what we can do to promote increased accuracy. So what did we do with Sally? We added modeling. She answered the sample of all the challenging problems and for Sally. The teacher answered the sample of problems before Sally, giving her the opportunity to see the teacher solving the problems as a model. And then we increased feedback. Instead of giving her feedback at the end of each worksheet completion, we gave her feedback immediately after each problem she missed. We gave her positive feedback for the ones she got right, but we gave her immediate feedback on the incorrect ones and told her and had her repeat those correctly before she moved on to the next problem. And what we got with Sally was, after we moved on to our intensification efforts, steady growth, and she met her goal within just a few weeks. So her accuracy improved. You can see this by her errors going down to almost to close to 0, and her fluency moving up. Baked into this intervention, by decreasing errors, her fluency is naturally going to go up, and it continued to go up after we were done. So conclusion. Intensifying interventions can seem overwhelming, but it can be simplified by focusing on problem types and breaking the intervention down into its components. Not just throwing things at it, guessing, but thinking about the problem type you have, the components you have currently, and what modifications you can make. Simple adjustments in interventions can have a big impact on student progress. So those are things to keep in mind as you go through this process, and go back to, I'm assuming, Madison, you can give these guys access to this presentation. And they can use those graphics if they want to moving forward. That's all I've got. I think we've got about 10 or 15 minutes for questions if you guys have them. I'm not very good with wait time. Somebody's got to have a question. So Jennifer, thanks for coming. I hope this was helpful.
So all of this information, the PowerPoint slides and the recording of this presentation, excuse me, will be available on the OSD Connect course, which you can find a link to in the registration of these community of practices. Our next one will be February 1st. So please join us for that. Look for a registration link to that in the Canvas course and on the listservs that we send out. If you don't have any questions and you are about to hop off, please go ahead and fill out our session evaluation. If you wouldn't mind, just take a quick minute to do that. but we still have some time left. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to shout them out, unmute yourself, put them in the chat. We're here to answer those.
All right, Madison, I think everybody's leaving.
It's amazing though. Thank you all so much. It was so clear and explicit. I didn't have any questions.
Well, that's always the hope, right?
Right, right. Is that PowerPoint? Are you able to make that available, or where could we have the reference back for that?
Yes, the PowerPoint will be available on our OSD Connect course.
Okay.
So if you are registered for that, then you will be able to find the PowerPoint for this presentation as well as our previous month's presentations if you want to look back through those.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me.
Okay.
All right.
My usual question is how do I make my district embrace MTSS, but that's the big question.
We can help with that too.
All right. Well,
Good luck.
all right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. All right.
Okay, Benjamin, I just want to make sure this will automatically save the recording, right?
Yes.
Okay. I get so nervous about that.
I understand.
All right, I'm gonna hang up now.
Okay.
Did a great job, Gary. Mhm. The turnout was good, Maddie.
We had 7 or 8 people.
Mm-hmm.
Weren't all of us.
Mm-hmm.
10 or 10:30.